Hello and welcome to everybody who has joined us for today's webinar, Making the Most of Baseline Assessment After a Break in Classroom-Based Teaching. I'm very happy to introduce Sue Holt, who's going to be doing today's presentation. She has extensive experience in British international education, working across the whole age range. She has spent most of her career at the British School of Brussels, where she held various posts, including Deputy Head Curriculum, Head of Secondary and Vice Principal, and finally as Acting Principal, before moving on to Argentina, where she became CHEMS Consultant for Latin America. Her work has taken her to Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. She followed this by teaching and consultancy in Spain and China, and returned to school leadership in Qatar, Jordan, and Egypt. And she's now returned to consultancy and she has worked for Chem Data for over 20 years and further developed her interest in assessment by completing a PG diploma in education with a focus on assessing and supporting children with specific learning difficulties. She's going to be talking to us today about gaining insights from baseline data to support students to meet their full potential, how baseline assessment can help you ask the right questions about your students, and making baseline assessment work for you in your school or classroom. A couple of housekeeping items. First of all, you are all in listen only mode. You've got two sections. You've got a chat section and a question section. If you have any technical difficulties, could you make contact with me in the chat section? And of course, you're very welcome to write down your questions throughout the webinar in the questions section, and Sue will be answering those at the end. I'm going to pass you straight over to Sue because she's got a lot of interesting information to tell us. So, Sue, welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well, and I look forward to going through this webinar with you this afternoon. So we get back to school as we know it at varying times, depending on the situation our countries are in with this current coronavirus crisis. I'm basing this presentation as if we were starting a new school year, and there are so many new things this school year. We'll have new year 7s coming into secondary school. So year 7 will be the first year of secondary school. I know it might be different in different systems. You will have other new students joining your school in all year groups. No doubt there will be new staff. And then, of course, we have the year 12, the first year of their post-16 studies. And what are the entry criteria going to be this year with all the exams cancelled for year 11s? And of course, with every school at the new year, we set new expectations. And I think there is a bit of a danger that this year people might start to make excuses saying that students have fallen behind and therefore they will lower their expectations. And I think there is absolutely no reason at all to do that. I think we can soon get the students back up to speed and our expectations of them should be raised. So where to start on all of this? You need to know the student starting points, each individual student starting point, so that you can help them the best possible way. And you need to gather as much data as possible, including any prior attainment data, and of course, baseline data for all. Now, your students will have had very different experiences depending on if they've been in lockdown, what their personal social circumstances have been, whether or not they've had good access to computers, whether there's been effective online learning from your schools, whether they've had the opportunity to make the most of that kind of online learning. If they didn't have any technology at home, then they've probably been doing paper-based activities, but they might not have had a good space in which to work. That's the kind of information that you know as a teacher. And all the data you have won't give you any answers, but it will help you ask better questions based on the evidence. Well, obviously, I don't know about your students' social circumstances, so I'm going to be focusing on the kind of thing which is kind of in the more public domain, with their prior attainment data and their baseline data. And of course, there is a problem with attainment data, and that is it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by that, I mean if expectations of future performance are based solely on prior attainment, then some students with low levels of attainment, for whatever reason, might continue to underachieve because the expectations of them will be set too low. And this is especially the case if setting and streaming limit their opportunities. So, for example, if a student with a low attainment in maths is put into a lower maths set, then possibly they can be entered for an exam where it's impossible for them to get the highest grade. Because there are tiers of entry in some exam subjects. So we are limiting their opportunity if we rely solely on attainment data. And that's where I think baseline data is really useful, because the tests give a measure of developed ability. And by developed ability, I mean their ability to access in a curriculum which is taught in English and examined in English. So it gives a snapshot of where a student is at that moment. It's not a label for life. It isn't a certificate. It's a snapshot of where the student is, which gives you and the student, because there has to be dialogue, an opportunity to address the areas that need to be addressed and to move forward. What is particularly brilliant about the Chem Centre tests, in my experience, is that they are adaptive computerized tests. So that means the level of difficulty of the questions is increased or decreased according to the answer of the previous question. So when your students are coming back into school, they might feel a bit stressed, especially if they're told they're going to have an assessment. But these computerized tests, because they're so adaptive, they actually reduce the stress. Students actually enjoy doing them. And no time is wasted by doing a whole series of questions which are far too easy for them, or feeling the stress build up because they're presented with a whole level of questions that they can't answer. Because they are adaptive, it means that no two students will answer exactly the same set of questions. And in my experience, I found that students who struggle with tests have often found this kind of computerized adaptive test their very first positive experience of doing a test, because the questions are geared increasingly towards their developed ability at that stage, and they can actually finish and feel like they've achieved something. And it's sometimes more worrying for the more able students because they keep getting more and more questions, getting harder and harder. But generally, they're stress-free tests, no time is wasted, and you get extremely valuable results. So I'm going to take this by key stage, probably spending a bit longer at key stage 3. And by the key stages, key stage 3 is the first 3 years of secondary school, so the 11 to 14-year-olds. Key stage 4 would be the GCSE years, years 10 and 11, or years 4 and 5, whichever system you use. And then, of course, there are the A-level or the IB diploma 2 years at the end. My recommendation is that as early as possible in the autumn term, use a baseline test, for example, mid-years, and use it with all year groups at key stage 3, so years 7, 8, and 9, if you can afford it. Obviously, these tests are not free, and the schools have got budgets. If you can't afford it with all year groups, then at least test year 7 and all the new students in years 8 and 9. This will give you 2 important sets of data. It will give you cohort data, which will give you a kind of picture, a broad picture of the year group, as well as individual pupil data, which will help you identify their particular strengths and weaknesses in areas to address. Let's first of all deal with the cohort data. you will get an overall media score presented as four bars on a graph. Now, if your cohort was completely average, you would have 25% of students in each of the bands A, B, C, and D, where A is the top 25% of the ability or of the students who've taken the test, and D is the bottom 25%. So this is real data from the school I was associated with once. And in that school, you can say that 47% of the students were in the top 25% of all the students who took a mid-years test across the world. And only 6% were in the lowest quartile, the D band. So that would give you an overall picture. But depending on the nature of your school, you might find that the components that make up that overall mid-year score are quite different. So when I look, so just have a picture in your head of that 47% of students who are in that A band, the top 25%. When we look at their vocabulary scores for word fluency and understanding, you can see that that's dropped quite a bit. It's dropped by 10%. So only 37% of students are in that top band for word fluency and understanding, which could have a very significant outcome on their final results. And there's an increased percentage in that lower quartile. So this is all the same group of students I'm showing you. If we then look at the maths, wow, we've now got 62% of students in that top band. If I look at their nonverbal score, which is recognizing shapes, matching patterns, applying spatial awareness and visual intuition, it's about 42%. Now, in most schools I've worked in, I found that normally the math score and the nonverbal score are very, very similar. In this particular school, they had had a focus on maths for the previous 2 years, and that had really pushed the maths on, as you could see from the scores. The nonverbal score is very useful, especially when dealing with students for whom English is not their first language. And I'll come on to that more later on. There is also a section on skills, which is a combination of proofreading and perceptual speed and accuracy, which will give you an indication about how well students can get things down on paper. This looks pretty useful in terms of future exam success. The proofreading is fine for a lot of the students, but there are still some students, a significant proportion. We've got 26% in the C and D bands, where they need much more help with the accuracy of their proofreading, which will help them understand questions better and also actually just improve their learning if they can read and really understand it accurately. Perceptual speed and accuracy, pretty useful, I suppose, if they're map reading, that kind of thing, if they're solving a technical problem, if they're dealing with geometry, all those kind of problem-solving skills. Again, a proportion of the students need particular help in that area. But who those students are, we'll come on to a bit later. But what does this mean as cohort data? What are you going to do with this as a school? For example, if your vocabulary scores are generally lower than your other scores, if you're working with a school with a significant proportion of children who don't speak English as a first language at home, then your vocabulary scores might be lower than the others. Now, this could be a particular issue this year when students might have been out of school for a long time and they might have been spending a long time at home not speaking in English, and their English may have gone backwards. And remember that even if students have got fluent conversational skills, it takes between 5 and 7 years working in the medium of English to give them what's called CALP, which is cognitive, academic, language proficiency, which is what they need really to succeed in the exams, especially exams where English is a significant part of writing longer answers. It takes 5 to 7 years. So if you have a student coming into year 7 who has got no English whatsoever, it's going to take them up until the end of year 11 to really be able to shine on average. So questions to be asked. Does the design of the curriculum address this need? Do you need more English lessons for all? Or do you need more English support for some? Do you need further emphasis on your whole school literacy strategy? Bear in mind that literacy is the key to the whole curriculum. Even in maths, there are lots of very wordy questions. So if they don't have the English skills, then they're going to miss out on a whole lot of understanding. And in terms of the curriculum, you're going to have students who are at very different stages. And is your curriculum design flexible enough? Is your timetables flexible enough to actually address those varying needs? One size does not fit all. And these questions need to be answered. The maths and the nonverbal graphs, as I've said, are often very similar. If the math scores are lower than the nonverbal, then a long period away from school may have reduced the child's fluency in maths, especially if they haven't been able, or they just haven't done the work that's been set by the school. So revisiting the basics will be needed to get them back up to speed. However, if the math scores are higher, then your online teaching or blended teaching or whatever you've been able to provide has been a real success. Congratulations. Certainly there was a maths boost in the data that you've just seen. And for students with English as an additional language, the non-verbal score is often the best measure of developability. And again, we will look at that in terms of individual students in just a moment. So skills, the areas like proofreading need to be developed to improve examination performance and also just to understand their learning. And in this area, school leaders might like to develop a whole school approach to improving these across all subjects. This is certainly not just something which is the English department's role. All teachers have a role in developing these skills. But it needs a whole school approach, nothing just fragmented. Now let's have a look at some individual pupil records. I've actually just chosen the record of one student. When this actually appears on your computer screen, you get the table and the graph, I'm going to show you in a moment, all on the same piece of paper. So it's a really easy thing to look at. But for the purpose of this presentation, so you can see it more easily, I've separated out the table from the graph. So on this student, let's look at the bottom. The overall mid-year score puts that student in band B, which is the second quartile. And you have a stay 9 there, a percentile rank, and a standard score. I'll explain what they mean in just a moment. The standard score is 101, 100 is average. So this student looks like a very average student if you just look at that score. But if you go and look at the individual scores, you will see that the vocabulary is in the bottom quartile and her math score was in the top quartile. And if you look at the percentile rank for that student, for vocabulary, the percentile rank is 12, which means that 88% of students did better than her in the vocabulary test. But if you look at her math score of 93, only 7% of students did better than her in the math test. And her non-verbal score is also high. It's in that top quartile, with only 15% of students doing better than her. So this is a very able student who, in this case, had a real problem with vocabulary. A low vocabulary score could be an indication of something like dyslexia, but in this case, it was just simply lack of English. So it was important to place her with students who were also able, and just provide the extra support in English. And whatever system your school has in place for that, is very much a school evolved thing, whether it's extra lessons, withdrawals from some lessons, in-class support. But that was a key area to focus on to enable her to access everything and to move on. Now, to be honest, I don't really like looking at those numbers like that. I prefer a more visual representation, and that's what you get on the graph. This is the same data just presented graphically. And what I like about that is that quickly, immediately, visually, you can see the problem. Now, the little diamond in the middle shows the actual score she achieved on the day of the test. And the lines either side are called the confidence band. And that means that they are 95% confident that should she take the test again, that her score would lie within that range. And what you will notice is that the vocabulary sort of band doesn't actually overlap with any of the other bands, and that indicates a specific problem. So although on average she comes out as average, she certainly isn't average. She's a well above average child with a particular problem in one area, which is vocabulary, and that needs to be addressed. Now, having that information at the beginning of the year with a new student is really, really important. Coming back to the skills, if that had been a very low skills score and all of the other bars had been high on the graph, that would also be significant. And I'm sure we've all experienced a child in the group when you've got a new class, you keep asking questions, and there's a really bright child keeps putting their hand up, they get all of the questions right, they're really interested. But when you come to look at their written work, you find it's terrible. You don't recognize this as the child who was really bright and engaged in your class. And a low skills score can indicate a specific learning difficulty. And that can be a trigger to have that child assessed by your SENCO, your Special Educational Needs Department, because it could indicate that the child was, say, dyslexic, for example, and would need further testing. So a low skills score can be an early indication that some further exploration of the child's needs needs to be addressed. Now, just a reminder about what those scores mean: standardized scores, stay nines, and percentile ranks. Because if you aren't dealing with them on a daily basis, it's easy to forget. So scores are standardized with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. That all fits into that lovely bell curve I will show you, and it means that 68% of scores fall between 85 and 115. So over 130 is about the top 2%, and a score of below 70 is really the bottom 2%. And really, in a school, or the kind of schools I've worked in over 40 years, you will find that if a score is 85 and below, that child will probably need a bit of support because they're in the bottom 14 or 15%. So a score of 85 would be really quite below average, and they might need some support. A percentile rank, just as comparing the student compares to other by putting them in rank order, really. And a stay 9 is really percentile ranks grouped into 9 parts. So stay 9 just means standard of 9. And from a personal point of view, I actually don't really like stay 9. I never really use them myself. I would look at standardized scores and percentile ranks, but they are there and some people like them. So, and they're included for you to make up your own mind. So how this looks, there's your bell curve. That's a result of all the students who've taken the test. 100 is average, over 100 is above average, and below 100 is below average, obviously. If they're above 130, are they gifted? And if their scores fall below 70, do they have a special educational need? And again, I would say below 85 might need looking at, unless it's vocabulary and it's just lack of exposure to English. These are the bands that I referred to, the band A, the top 25%, down to, I don't know why it says B and B and B and C and D. It should just say B, C, D. So, and D is the lower band, the lowest band. These are those wonderful stay lines, where a stay line of 9 represents the top 4%, and a stay line of 1 represents the bottom 4%. And that just shows you how the percentile ranks are distributed from up to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, up to 99. So how to use that IPR, that individual pupil record? Again, look for inconsistencies, non-overlapping scores, as well as, the overall score can be misleading. Refer as necessary to your SENCO. And if you set or stream by ability, take care of using that overall score. I've just shown that that student that I was giving you an example of was not just average. Just come back to that student again. She comes out with an average score, but was extremely able in maths and had a specific weakness in vocabulary, which was also affecting her ability to proofread, which is why her skills were just average. Again, so an easy visualization on the graph to show where some further exploration of that student's data might be required. Now, for going into year 10, there is the YELLA's test, the year 11 information system. And I would suggest that as early as possible in the new term, you test all year 10s and new year 11s. You get band profiles, the cohort data, and individual pupil records. They're produced just like in Midias. But in addition, you get predictive chances graphs, which can be the basis of very important learning conversations with students. Now, a chances graph is an indication of a predicted grade. It shows the chances of a student achieving a particular grade in a particular subject. This is real data on a student for GCSE English. So the prediction there is the highest bar on the graph, the 33% chance of getting a grade D. But you can see that there is also a chance the student could get a higher grade. And so by sitting down with the student and going through their targets with them, I mean, there's no point in just saying to them, oh, well, I think you can do better, your target's a B. You have to explain to the student what the target is and how they're going to get there. So the how is very important to break down in this learning conversation what is required to move on to the next step and to move themselves to the upper end of the predictions. These chances graphs just show that on average, a student who got a similar score in the test got that grade. But there is absolutely no reason at all why that student shouldn't be one of the whatever it is, 28% who did better than that. And of course, if they're very lazy students, they should be one of the students who got worse than that. So the importance of the learning conversation, understanding their difficulties and giving them next steps can't be overemphasized. I don't think you should ever give just a predicted grade. I think there needs to be a learning conversation looking at the chances. So that might be the most likely grade. That can be very demotivating, but you can use that to turn things around, to give them a motivational conversation about what the next steps they need to take to move on to the higher level of grade. Now, this is a particularly complicated one this year because In many schools, students' entry onto A-level or IB courses is determined by their GCSE results. And this year, there will be some consternation because there haven't been any exams to determine those results, and they've been awarded grades by teachers' recommendations in many ways. And that is not without problems. I do feel very sorry for all the teachers who have been involved in making those decisions. I'm sure there have been enormous pressures on you from influential parents, from school leaders, from the students themselves, and it'd be a very, very difficult situation. So in the absence of grades generated by exams this year, I do think that the ALICE test, which is predicting for A-levels, and the very similar IBE test, which is predicting for the IB diploma, could be extremely useful in helping place students on appropriate courses. And I have used this when we had all sorts of things available. I mean, I used to always run a year 12 induction where we did an ALICE or an IBE test, and it was highly effective. So what I would suggest you consider is test all the students as the first step in a post-16 induction program before they actually start their new courses. So test all the students. Again, it's an adaptive test. It's relatively curriculum-free. And from that, you will get a set of chances graphs generated. I would also suggest that at this stage, you leave it fairly open, that you don't suggest subject choices at this stage. And you will receive chances graphs for each of the subjects you offer. And that might help influence a student's decision because the graphs aren't the same for each subject. And you can also get a set of predictions based on the GCSE grades if they're available. And that can be very useful if you've got both sets, the test data predictions and the GCSE grade predictions. The prediction reports look very much like the chances graph you've just seen for YELLIS. This is an example from an IB one, but it would be the same if it was A-level. So it gives the expected grade, but it also shows the chances a student has of getting other grades. And this can be a big discussion with the students about which courses they might choose. You would get two sets of those prediction data. You would get one set based on their GCSE results and another set based on the test. Now that can be extremely useful because you can compare the data generated from the test with the data generated from the grades. And this could give some indication about motivation. For example, if the data from the test predicts higher grades than the data from the grades, this could give an indication that the student hasn't been very well motivated, or there have been some other factors which have affected their achievement at GCSE. Now, it's really worth discussing these with each student. It's very time consuming, I appreciate that, but it's worth it. And it's best done by someone who knows the student well. But in several schools, even if I didn't know the student well, while I was getting staff on board with the idea, I would do most of the interviews myself, just to ensure that every student had that one person spending time with them, looking at all of their data, and helping them decide future courses. But I found that staff very quickly became on board and they wanted to do it themselves because they knew other things about the student which I didn't. And that made it more effective than me doing it. But I was just doing it to kickstart the process. So it's really important that the students have that teacher time at the beginning of two of the most important years of their lives, which will determine their university courses if that's their ambition for the future. So finally, I would like to say that the baseline data, especially this year, is a very useful tool in your tool chest, and you should really make sure you make the most of it. I don't know whether we have any primary colleagues listening in. I focus this particularly on secondary, but there is a fabulous program which is well worth using for primary called INCAS. And I would really strongly recommend that your primary staff use that. And if you have a large number of students with special educational needs, it's also a very useful one to do with Year 7. And it can be a good indication of where their particular difficulties lie. So the baseline data is fun for the students to acquire because they quite like doing the adaptive tests. But the information it gives you is time very well invested. So please do make sure you make the most of it. So thank you very much for listening. And we'll now take any questions, or at least Suzanne will pass your questions to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. Just before I do a poll, a little survey, somebody had a relevant thing. Could you please repeat the tool that you were suggesting to use for primary teachers? Because one of our colleagues who's joined us has missed the name of it.
Okay, it's called INCAS, which is the Interactive Computer Assessment System. So it's like, you know, Inca in the in Peru. So it's INCAS, INCAS. It's extremely useful. In fact, it's my favorite of all of the baseline data programs. It's my favorite.
Thank you very much. What we are going to do now before we move on to the rest of the questions is that we've got a little survey for our participants. We'd like to ask you, what is the biggest obstacle for the implementation of a data policy in your school? And I've just opened the poll. If you wouldn't mind joining in and just voting by clicking on one of the buttons, that would be fantastic. And whilst we're voting, Sue, I'm going to ask you one of these questions. This is a good one. So far you've talked about GCSEs, IGCSEs, A-levels. Do the predictions just cover those, or do they cover BTEC levels too?
BTEC, I know it certainly predicts to the advanced BTEC. I haven't ever offered lower level BTECs, if you know what I mean. I've only offered level 3 BTECs. So I don't think Alice does level 2 BTECs. It might, but it certainly, but Alice certainly does level 3 BTECs.
Thank you very much. I will leave the poll open for a couple of more seconds. When would you normally use ALICE tests? In the final term of Year 11, before they move up to the first year of A levels, or at the beginning of Year 12 when they come back after the break?
Well, I've normally used at the very beginning of Year 12, simply because in the kind of schools I've worked in, there have been a lot of new students that joined the school in Year 12. And so I wanted all the students to be doing the test at the same time. So I found that the beginning of the school year was a better time to do any kind of testing than at the end, because we didn't have stable populations of students.
That's great. Now, I think we've had plenty of time to do some voting. Let me just share that. So, what is the biggest obstacle for the implementation of data policy in your school? We've got 23% vision and direction. Clarity is 21%. Training 31%. Access to data 21%. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Sue.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's quite alarming that access to data is still a problem, and lack of clarity. I do think it's something which is really important. I mean, to do the test and to get the value from them, they need to be shared. It's sad but not surprising. I mean, certainly when I've been doing interviews with new staff in previous schools, and I've asked them about data in the interview, and they've kind of commented it was something the senior management team used. Well, basically, I think the most useful use of the data is to inform classroom teaching. So I think, you know, the teachers have to understand the data and they have to use it in their classroom teaching. And I think if it's just used by management, then it's often used wrongly as a performance management school, as a stick to beat teachers with. And I don't think that's the right use of it. It's to inform how you would formulate your school development plan. In other words, designing your curriculum to meet the needs of the students, but also to inform what happens in the teaching and learning in the classroom. So I think that the data really has to be widely understood and shared. And I would suggest that at the beginning of every school year, there needs to be a refresher course in it. I don't mean churning out the same presentation at the beginning of every school year so everybody yawns, but people who are familiar with the data, it could be done within departments, for example. They have to make sure that all staff are up and running with the data and understand it as a tool to improve their teaching, not as a performance management target.
Thank you. I agree with you totally. And I was just going to say that the way that we managed to embed data and data literacy at our schools is that we used to make it the first point on any departmental agenda, talking about data in the sense of progress from different students, so that we can identify strategies that work with particular students and almost use them like case studies in order that we could share good practice.
I think it's really useful if it's done it as a sharing of case studies and sharing good practice. I think where it becomes problematical is if there's just a big Excel sheet thrown up on the screen with a green box for someone who's on track and a red box for someone who isn't. I think it has to be more nuanced than that, and sharing good practice and how you've actually moved a student on, I think, is the best way forward.
Thank you. I've got another one here. If Alice can give data for each of the subjects that a school offers, is it effective to help in choosing, or sort of help in the choice of languages, or, for example, design courses like media studies, design and technology?
Well, I think it could be, especially this year, because I do find that in some schools and in some cultures, parents seem to want their children to be doctors, engineers, and lawyers, and they have them choosing A-levels or IB courses that direct them down that route, whereas their strengths might not be in those areas. And so if you've got a whole set of data, it could indicate the areas where the students have got greater interest and greater strengths. And in the absence of exam-based GCSE results, I think the data from that would be quite useful. What I would say as a caveat there is that minority subjects are not always covered by the by Alice and IBE. So if they don't have enough data to make predictions, then they're not going to take a guess at it. They are research based, and if they don't have enough data to generate that prediction, then they won't generate it. So for subjects which are minority subjects, they might not be able to have the data. I think I found that with Arabic, for example. I couldn't get any predictions for Arabic.
Okay, thank you. This is a question referring back to your example at, I think it was Midges, with the EAL student,
Yes.
where the vocabulary is a lot lower than the other skills. Do you think giving extra English support helps?
Yes, absolutely. And how you do that and depends on the need of the student. I think they might need to, and it also depends on the resources available and whether they have to pay extra for it or whatever. But I do think they need some intensive English at the beginning of their time in the school. I don't think they can just be expected to pick it up somehow by osmosis. I think they need some intensive extra support. And the other thing which is very interesting to look at is that sometimes a student who has English as an additional language, they might also have a specific learning difficulty, but you can't really tell what's causing their low vocabulary. But if you've given them lots of intensive English support and you find there is still some difficulty after a year or more, then that might indicate there's a specific learning difficulty which might need a different approach or some additional support. So I think it's sometimes students with a specific learning difficulty get overlooked because people just assume it's an English issue.
That's great. I've got a question here. So we have pupils coming from the IB program and as well as Cambridge Primary. So is it possible that students who are coming out of both programs can take INCUS?
Well, if we're talking, yes, if we're talking it's curriculum free, and if we're talking about INCAS, you'll be looking at, are you talking about this for students in year 6 or year 7?
I am not sure.
Yeah,
Basically, is INCAS program specific? I think is a succinct way of
no,
putting it.
INCAS is not program specific, and I would use it. I mean, if they don't have enough English, if they really don't have enough English, there's not much point in doing it with a year 1 student or a year 2 student. If English is their first language, then you can do it from kind of year 1 upwards. In many schools I've worked in, we've used it from year 3 upwards because you would get enough data generated. So you used it like in years 3, 4, 5, and 6. And with some specific students in year 7, if we suspected they might have a specific learning difficulty. So it can be used as a screener for year 7, but really for most students in year 7, you would use Midias. And none of these are program specific. So, I mean, it won't, with Midias and Yellis, it's not going to predict an MYP grade. That is geared to giving GCSE grades. But the actual, in terms of predictive data, but in terms of getting the actual profile of the student, then it doesn't matter which program they're on. The profile is telling you their strengths and their areas that might need further development.
Okay. We were talking earlier about when to take the tests, and we were talking about ALICE, whether they should be doing the ALICE at the beginning of year 12 or at the end of year 11. And somebody had a follow-on question just asking, won't they have already made their A-level choices before they start year 12? How does it fit?
Well, in every school I've worked in, students have made provisional A-level choices, which has helped with timetabling. But very often when they're not stuck with those choices, they often change their mind in the light of their results and also their teachers' recommendations. So I don't think the A-level choices, as far as I'm concerned, were just there to help with timetabling, and that students could change course at the beginning of the year, which is why I always had a year 12 induction, so we could actually finalize the best course for the students. And if the baseline test is included, then that's a very good time to do it. I mean, most students would send out option forms like, I don't know, February, March, ready for timetabling. And between February and March and the results in August, people's ideas can change a lot, especially when you're 16 years old.
I agree. We always had a 6-week time period at the beginning of year 12 where changes in subject could be made depending on, obviously, results at GCSE, but also on whether they actually enjoyed the course or not.
Yes, and also, practically as well, it's also the space in the group.
Yes.
That can be an issue, but generally, making choices early is just a way to facilitate timetabling. It's not determining a student's future.
Indeed. I've got another one about sixth form. Are the predictions for IB subjects done alongside the A-level subject or independently? For instance, is IB physics treated in the same way as A-level physics or completely independently?
Well, it would be independently. I mean, they've based the predictions based on previous IB results. So they look at on average a student with this score on the baseline test got this grade in IB for physics, and that's how the prediction is made. So it's completely independent whether it's A-level. I mean, the test is very similar, but the prediction for A-levels is based on A-level data, and the predictions for IB is based on IB.
Thank you. I've got another question about timing of tests. For INCAS, when would you do it in the first term, so this autumn term, and would you recommend that they do the test all in one go?
No, because the first thing is I would do it as early as possible in the in the autumn term, because the idea is that you get a picture of your class, so it doesn't take you half a term to get before you know what their strengths and weaknesses are. But I do appreciate that when you're dealing with younger children, you might want to take a little while to settle them into routines before you start giving them a test. Now, the tests are in little sections for INCAS. I don't have the timings right now in my head, but there's a bit of reading, there's a bit of math, there's all sorts of little bits of the test, and each test would take up to 20 minutes. But you wouldn't want to sit them down in year 3 and just have them like ploughing through one test after another. So you might want to divide it up into 2 or 3 short sessions.
Okay, thank you.
But the data was exceptionally useful. I mean, for example, on reading, you would get their ability to decode, word recognition, understanding, even some spelling. You know, it is extremely useful. For example, I mean, I know we're talking about secondary, but what I found in one school was that in general, decoding needed was okay, and word recognition was kind of a bit poorer, except for kids who were Chinese, for example, and they were used to dealing with the pictorial vocabulary, and they were very good at word recognition, but they found decoding much more difficult. So they needed a different approach to learn to read. So the information is fantastic.
That's great. I have a question, because you were really, really effective in explaining all the data and percentiles and things like that. But I was wondering whether you could just explain to us what a standardized score is.
Okay, so when they've taken all the scores, what they do is they do a mathematical alteration to them to make them fit in between 1 and 100. Okay, so that you're going to get, well, with 100 as the mean. So they will, when you saw that bell curve, that was showing you all the scores with the mean being given a score of 100. So if you were doing a test of 200, you know, if there were 200 marks, you might say that the middle score was going to be 100 or whatever. But what they do, they make everything fit so that the mean, or the average score, is 100, and all the other scores spread out either side of it. It's called a normal distribution. And so they take that standardized score. So that it means that no matter what test you do, you can compare the result. So if you were, you know what it's like in a school exam, a student might say, oh, I got 93% in maths, but I only got 70% in physics. But you found that all the physics results were quite low because it was a really hard exam, and all the maths results were high because it was a much easier exam. This levels the playing field so that all the scores are comparable. And it means that you can use that, that standardized data kind of year on year to get true comparisons.
That's really helpful.
I hope that's not too muddled.
Well, I found it clear, so I hope everybody listening found it clear. It was very, very helpful. One final question. With regard to midges, can it be taken by a different age group, years 7, 8 and 9? How can the questions be answered by students across all years?
Well, it's an adaptive test. So that means that there's a huge bank of questions, and depending on the answer of their question, if they get it right, they get a harder question. If they get that one right, they get a harder question. If they get it wrong, they get an easier question, and it goes on until their level has been established. So they've standardized the results across years 7, 8, and 9, looking at that age group. So they will have standardized it against all year 7s and all year 8s and all year 9s. So no student will get the same set of questions as anybody else, and they've been standardized by age group anyway, so that they're comparable. So they're comparing the results of all year 7 with all year 7 students. They're comparing the results of of your year 8 with all year 8 students. So it's comparative data.
That's fantastic. And I think we haven't got any more time for any more questions. So
I hope they found it useful and thank them for participating.
Well, we've had a lot of questions today, so thank you very much to you, Sue, for such an interesting presentation, and thank you to the participants for so much interest and so many interesting questions. So I'm going to sign us off, so thank you very much. Oh, lots of people saying thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.